Welcome back, everyone. In this video, we're going to talk about the Qing dynasty, the last imperial dynasty in the history of China. What sets the Qing apart from some other Chinese dynasties is that they are not Han Chinese, that is, they're not ethnically, indigenously Chinese, but they are, again, a Jurchen group. We've seen this before earlier in Chinese history, and they are allied with Mongol tribesmen led by this leader Nurhaci, who we talked about in an earlier lecture. So we have this Jurchen army led by Nurhaci, and it's assisted by Mongol tribesmen who provide invaluable cavalry support for these armies. Nevertheless, the Qing, led by Nurhaci, still needed more allies, and they find important allies, an important source of allies, a major component of their eventually successful army will be Han Chinese allies. So those who are ethnically indigenous Chinese peoples will join with the non-Chinese group, this Manchu-Mongol alliance from the north, because of their dissatisfaction with the Ming dynasty at the time. The Manchu warriors were grouped into 8 banners, that is, 8 different segments of the army, and then the Green Standard Army were the Han Chinese allies who fought with them against the Ming dynasty. The Mongols didn't have the same idea of clanship and heritage as the Han Chinese, but those who could pass the state examinations could still work for the state, could still be integrated in the Chinese bureaucracy. Nurhaci died in 1626 and was succeeded by his 8th son, Hong Tanji, who continued to maintain this alliance and gave the Qing the name Manchu for the united Jurchen group. So they start to call themselves Manchus from Manchuria. In 1636, Hong Taiji managed to defeat the Mongols and claim the name of emperor. He set up a government based on the imperial Chinese model. There were 6 executive ministries, ministries of rights, finance, personnel, military, punishments, and public works. The top ranks were nevertheless reserved for the Manchu. So Han Chinese and some Mongols could enter the lower ranks of this government administration, but the leading positions were still reserved for Manchu. That refers to, again, the unification of all the Jurchen peoples. Hong Taiji died suddenly in 1643, and compromise or regency succession was declared, and then the next year peasant rebels sacked Beijing. So remember that towards the end of the Ming dynasty we see 2 currents of dissatisfaction. The invasions from the north led by the Qing, the Manchu warriors, and peasant rebellions from the interior. And so the Manchu have kind of been stymied by the early death of Hong Taiji, but then the peasant rebellions are still ongoing, still successful, and they sack the Ming capital of Beijing. Ming continue to fight with one another in the south, but in the north, the Ming Chinese aristocrats recognized that they had more in common with the Manchu invaders than they did with Chinese peasant rebels. And so they united with the Manchu, and increasingly even successors of the Ming dynasty united with these Manchu invaders to overthrow their own government. Beijing was captured shortly afterwards by the Manchu, so Beijing is sacked by the peasants, but the peasants don't really know how to take it over. So there's a power vacuum. The Manchu come in, they seize Beijing, and they invest their leader, known as the Shunzi Emperor, as the son of heaven, now of taking up the mandate of heaven. The Ming fighters in the south continued to resist, but they were finally defeated in 1662, and China was reunified under this new dynasty. Han Chinese subordinates continued to govern the southern parts of China. They acknowledged the rule of the Qing dynasty, but they were allowed to continue to rule the southern reaches of China as regents for the Qing dynasty. The Dogon Regency maintained even some of the more important cities under Han Chinese rule. However, there was widespread resistance to some of the cultural aspects of the Manchus, in particular hairstyle. Remember that previous invaders in the north had typically gone through this process of sinicization, where they adopted Chinese culture. And the Manchu, the Qing dynasty, they're going to keep Chinese government structures, but they're going to try and maintain some of their northern cultural practices. And this leads to widespread resistance among the Han Chinese and pretty authoritarian efforts to force the Han Chinese to conform. There were some pretty brutal massacres that were carried out of those who refused to adapt to Manchu lifestyles and culture. Also in the year 1662, the year that Ming resistance finally ended, the Shunzi emperor died and was replaced by the Kangxi emperor, who was 8 years old at the time. He had a regency of 4 ministers, but they were not princes, they were not uncles. Typically when you have an uncle or a prince who's a regent, they will try and take over themselves. These regents were not related to the royal family, and so they were less of a threat. Even so, by 1669, so when he's only 15 years old, Kangxi had removed the most successful regent and had seized authority for himself. And he would maintain imperial authority. He would be probably one of the more successful of the Qing emperors. And it's his autobiography that we're reading for the second half of this class, by maintaining the Confucian examination system. This offered paths to career success working for the government, not only for the Manchus, but even for members of the Han Chinese population. So this was a way of bringing the two populations together. He also appealed to the status of the Manchu as outsiders, and he appealed to this status to maintain the loyalty of other non-Chinese allies, Uyghurs, Mongols, and Tibetans. And so this is a way of saying, those of you who are indigenous Chinese peoples, there is still a way for you to follow the traditional system to rise to the top and to have career success. Those of you who are outsiders, we're outsiders as well, and we're going to root for you and we're going to protect your interests. The 3 Ming generals who had, as I say, maintained a sort of semi-autonomous status in the southern parts of the Chinese Empire, had rebelled and then offered a concession. They said, we'll make peace, we'll accept your sovereignty, but you have to give us these lands to hold on a hereditary basis. Remember, this is always the contest. How do you give land to your subordinates in a way that makes them satisfied, but still maintain some kind of control of that land? They don't become independent. Typically, once you have land that you hold as your families, that you hand down, you don't need the emperor anymore. You start to become independent. You start to become a threat. And so after he defeats them, the Kangxi emperor refuses to accept the settlement. He puts down the rebellion eventually. The rebellion lasts for a long time, but by 1681, the Qing have regained full control over southern China. It's southern China that's now pretty devastated by over a decade of war, but the Qing now do have control over all the territories of the Chinese region. And the Kangxi would increase his territory and his authority by leading successful expeditions into Taiwan and Mongolia. He also made a treaty with Russia, and so both these major Asian regions or northern Asian regions are starting to come more and more into contact with one another. Remember, one of our themes of this course is the interaction between Asia and Europe. And we typically think of those people coming by sea, but the China-Russia relationship is going to be increasingly important as we move through the rest of the history of China. After Kangxi died in 1722, he was succeeded by his fourth son, Prince Yong, who became the Yongzhen Emperor. He was 45 when he came to reign, and some thought that he had usurped the crown from one of his younger brothers, who perhaps would have offered more stability going forward. You could have said, look, this person's going to be the emperor for 40 years, just like Kangxi had been. But he has seized the throne and he has a sense of urgency to reign. So instead of a sense of stability, as we have with Kangxi, with the Yongzhen Emperor, we have a sense of urgency to come to reign. He promoted Confucian orthodoxy and outlawed Christianity, and he expanded his control or imperial control of state bureaucracy and increased the efficiency of revenue collection. He filled government positions with more minor officials who required his patronage to survive. He provided more land to those who could not pay the land tax to increase the tax base. And he made the administration of the Grand Canal more efficient. And so these reforms that he carried out meant that the emperors gained more control of the government. And that the government itself became more stable and was more thoroughly controlled by the emperors. After the Yongzheng Emperor dies in 1735, he is succeeded by his son, the Qianlong Emperor, who secured control of the empire, putting down rebellions, and continued the process of centralizing government control. So the population starts to grow during this period. We start to find that the Han and Manchu populations are starting to intermingle. The population grows rapidly. The population of China triples during the 18th century. It had been a large population before, becomes a really large population during the 18th century. And this population growth is associated with the normal challenges. So you have struggles with disease and infant mortality that are a result of there being more people than food. That's the optimal amount of food that's required to feed them. And so you start to see actually the introduction of foreign food crops, like peanuts and potatoes, that are an increasingly important part of keeping China fully sustained and fully fed. And so at the same time as we have the emperors becoming more powerful, they're starting to be able to centralize government power. You also see that there are some challenges on the horizon that the Qing will struggle to accommodate. And we'll talk about those challenges and the response of the emperors to them in the next video.